You've probably heard that Rome did not fall in a single day, that it was a slow, gradual, inevitable process. But what if I told you there was an exact moment, a date, a battlefield, a single day when the fate of the greatest empire the world had ever known was sealed once and for all? This is not theory, it is not speculation, it is history, and most people simply never knew it because no one told it the right way. The Roman Empire, up until then, was synonymous with absolute power. Its legions marched across the world as if victory were an obligation, not a possibility. Entire peoples trembled at the mere sound of Rome's name, and for good reason. But behind all that unshakable glory, cracks were forming. Cracks the Romans themselves refused to see. Arrogance disguised as confidence. Mistakes disguised as strategy. And when those cracks finally met the right pressure, the collapse was swift, brutal, and irreversible. What happened in 378 AD on the outskirts of a city called Adrianople was not merely a battle. It was the day Rome looked into the eyes of its own mortality and blinked. An emperor died. An army was annihilated, and an illusion of invincibility that had endured for centuries vanished in a single August afternoon. If you want to understand how great empires fall, how pride blinds powerful leaders, and what Rome's story still has to teach us today, you are in the right place. Stay until the end, because this story will surprise you. The 4th century was, without exaggeration, one of the most turbulent periods the Roman Empire ever faced. Its borders, which for centuries had seemed like impenetrable walls, were beginning to crack under pressure coming from every direction. It was not merely a military issue. It was as if the very ground upon which Rome had built its greatness was starting to tremble. The so-called barbarians were not knocking at the gates out of ambition. They were being pushed by something far more brutal than conquest: fear. And when fear moves entire peoples, no frontier holds for long. The Visigoths were one of those peoples. Warriors, yes, but also families, children, elders, human beings who had left behind everything they knew because a devastating force known as the Huns was sweeping across Eastern Europe like a storm of fire. Those familiar with the history of the Huns understand that there was no negotiation, no compromise, only flight or death. The Visigoths chose flight, and the destination they saw was Roman territory, that land of order and prosperity which, from a distance, seemed like salvation. They did not come as invaders, they came as refugees. What happened next, however, became one of the darkest chapters in Roman administration. The authorities who were meant to receive and organize the Visigoths' entry saw instead an opportunity for easy enrichment. Exploitation, humiliation, deliberate starvation. This was the welcome given to a people who had arrived seeking protection. Rome, which prided itself on being the light of civilization, behaved like any power that forgets its own values when corrupted by authority, and like every grave mistake made by those in command, this one would carry an extraordinarily high price, sooner than anyone could have imagined. And it was precisely from that exploitation, from that systematic humiliation, that the spark emerged, the one no Roman had expected. There is a limit to what a human being can endure. The Visigoths, after crossing the Danube in search of safety, found on the other side not the promise of a better life, but the organized cruelty of those who were meant to protect them. The famine did not come by chance. It was used as a tool of control. When a people is cornered between humiliation and death, rebellion is not a choice, it is an inevitable consequence. On the other side of this equation stood Emperor Valens, a man burdened with ruling the Eastern Roman Empire at one of the most delicate moments in its history. When the uprising erupted, Valens made a decision that any seasoned strategist would recognize as fatal. He advanced toward confrontation without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian, who was already on his way. Pride, haste, political calculation, whatever the reason, outweighed prudence, and leaders who allow ego to command strategic decisions often pay a price that extends far beyond themselves. To make matters worse, there was one mistake that the battlefield never forgives: underestimating the enemy. The intelligence reports that reached Valens indicated a Visigothic force far smaller than reality. Imagine entering a negotiation believing the other side has limited resources, only to discover midway that they possess twice what you calculated. Except in this case, those resources were spears, horses, and years of accumulated rage. Rome marched toward Adrianople with too much confidence and too little information, and the stage was set for the darkest day of the empire. The Battle of Adrianople, 378 A.D. The stage was set. The mistakes had already been made, and on August 9, 378 A.D., the sun rose scorching over the region of Adrianople, known today as Edirne in modern-day Turkey. The Roman army marched for hours beneath that suffocating heat, without adequate rest, without sufficient water, arriving at the battlefield already exhausted before the fighting had even begun. It is the kind of detail that may seem minor on paper, but any experienced soldier knows it can determine the outcome of a confrontation. Rome did not lose only on that field; it had been losing since the morning. The Roman attack was disorderly, impatient, as if the thirst for victory had spoken louder than strategy, and as the legionaries advanced with confidence, something no one expected happened. The Visigothic cavalry, which had withdrawn to forage, returned to the battlefield at an absolutely decisive moment. Suddenly, what had appeared to be a controlled engagement turned into a nightmare unfolding in real time. The Romans, already compressed and disorganized, were struck from all sides, a maneuver that centuries later military scholars still cite as an example of tactical devastation. The encirclement was complete. The Eastern Roman army, one of the most feared military forces of the ancient world, was literally annihilated on that field. And amid the chaos, Emperor Valens himself was killed. Historical accounts differ on exactly how, but they agree on one point: he did not survive. A Roman emperor dying in battle was rare, heavy with symbolism. Rome had bled before, it had lost battles before, but what followed Adrianople would be unlike anything the empire had ever faced. Immediate consequences. The dust of Adrianople had not yet settled when Rome began to feel the weight of what it had lost. It was not merely a battle, it was an entire generation of soldiers buried on that field. A significant portion of the Eastern Roman army, that war machine built over centuries of discipline and conquest, had been wiped out in a single August day. It was as if a market-leading company, the undisputed reference in its sector, suddenly lost all of its most experienced professionals at once and still had to open its doors the very next morning. But the deepest damage was not the number of fallen soldiers. It was something far harder to rebuild: reputation. Rome had constructed its dominance not only through force, but through the fear that force inspired. The peoples surrounding the empire obeyed, negotiated, and retreated because they believed Rome was invincible. Adrianople tore that veil apart once and for all. What had once been certainty became doubt, and in the ancient world, when Rome's enemies stopped fearing her, the balance of power was never the same again. And it was then that Rome committed what may have been its most revealing mistake. To rebuild its devastated ranks, the empire increasingly recruited Germanic peoples into its own army, the so-called foederati. In practice, Rome was paying to be defended by the very peoples it had once tried to subjugate. It was a solution that worked in the short term, but concealed a dangerous contradiction. How far does the loyalty of those who fight for pay rather than belonging truly extend? That unanswered question would haunt Rome for decades, and its consequences would arrive in a way no one could ignore. Historical impact. Adrianople was not merely a lost battle, it was the moment when the relationship between Rome and the barbarian peoples changed forever. Before 378 AD, Rome dictated the rules. The barbarians entered the empire on Roman terms, settled where Rome determined, and fought under Roman commanders. After Adrianople, that equation was turned upside down. The Visigoths began negotiating as equals, occupying territories with autonomy and imposing their own conditions. Rome still existed, but it was no longer the same Rome. What the battle revealed, brutally and definitively, was the fragility of a system that had functioned for centuries, yet was rotting from within. The Roman army, once the most efficient and disciplined institution in the Western world, had become dependent, poorly coordinated, and inadequately supplied. It is the same phenomenon seen in dominant organizations that control their markets for so long they forget to reinvent themselves, and when crisis strikes, they discover that the structure that seemed solid was, in truth, a facade. Rome had been living behind that facade longer than it cared to admit. Today, historians around the world point to Adrianople as one of the most decisive milestones in the decline of the Western Roman Empire, the one that would culminate in its fall in 476 AD, less than a century later. It was not a lightning bolt from a clear blue sky. It was the result of a chain of poor decisions, institutional arrogance, and an inability to recognize its own limits. In that sense, Rome's story is a mirror, one that reflects not only the past of an empire, but recurring patterns in civilizations, organizations, and human lives, and it still holds many revelations for those willing to look directly into it. Conclusion. So after all of this, one question remains impossible to ignore. What could Rome have done differently? Would a less prideful emperor, a more prudent decision, a more honest assessment of its own limits have changed the course of Western history entirely? Think about that, because the truth is, Adrianople was not an accident. It was the sum of wrong choices made by people who believed themselves to be invincible. And that pattern, my friend, did not remain buried in the 4th century. It repeats itself in companies that dominate their markets and forget to reinvent themselves, in leaders who confuse power with wisdom, in civilizations that grow so large they lose the ability to see their own cracks. Rome left us a lesson worth its weight in gold. Greatness without humility is simply the first step toward decline. And those who study history do not do so to admire the past. They study it to avoid repeating the same mistakes in the present. Now I want to hear from you. In your opinion, could Rome have avoided the Battle of Adrianople? What should Valens have done differently? Leave your answer in the comments. You'll see that this discussion is far more relevant than it may seem. And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel isn't about dusty dates and forgotten names. It's about understanding the world through history. If you want to keep learning about the secrets, the wars, and the decisions that shaped humanity, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because there's much more powerful history ahead and you won't want to miss a single moment.